JJK is over. Kind of. Well, at least the fighting is over. Well, the fighting against other people, not the fighting for your life. Apparently, that's what the next couple of chapters are going to be about. And boy, oh boy, do people not know how to feel about it. And boy, oh boy, am I people. I am of two minds about this chapter, and both of them are yelling at me at full volume. On one hand, we got pretty much the happiest ending we could have hoped for from JJK. And on the other hand, we got a couple really disappointing conclusions to some fights. And as we now only have 3 chapters left, it feels as though we're not going to get really any of the questions we want answered, which hurts, but it's also hard to hurt when you're looking at the original New Gen Team 7 all together on their new missions to do things like save Yuta's life. The chapter is a real doozy because you can't sit here and genuinely be upset about the conclusion, but how we got there just feels lucky, man. See, because in this chapter, we not only got to see the internal conflict raging between Megami and Sukuna, but we also got to see things like the eradication of Sukuna and the reconvening of Team Gojo. We got to see Gojo's final words to all of his students. We got to see some classic Team Gojo antics. Yuji and Megami smiled and laughed, which we haven't seen for 100 chapters. And the chapter ends with introducing the fact that Yuta may in fact still be alive. So yeah, things could be a whole lot worse. And yet you're still gonna find something to complain about, aren't you, Nick? Yeah, probably. It's kind of my job, I'm sorry. But I promise I have more good things to say about this chapter than bad. I think. I haven't filmed the video yet. And thus, with no further ado, let's get directly into chapter 268 of JJK Explained. But before we get to explaining anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you want to see me try to bring real-life challenges to the anime world, go ahead and follow the brand new channel that I created with Stephen Heat, Chris Barnett, and Danny Mata called Anime IRL. Or if you just want to hear me talk about anime and manga, go ahead and follow my anime podcast, Talkers Anonymous, where me and Danny Mata break down everything that happened in anime and manga this week. It's available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. So, chapter 268 does not start off exactly where chapter 267 left off. In fact, it starts with a massive tonal and location shift, as we see that Sukuna has apparently incurred so much damage in the battle against Nobara and Yuji that he's now just having a conversation with Megami. And thus the chapter begins with Sukuna asking Megami, so how do you think you'll be able to go on? You had your body stolen by me. You watched your own body murder your sister. You turned away the hands reaching out to you. That's when Yuji was able to connect to Megami's soul when they were inside of Yuta's domain. Which, like, honestly, fair point. If you hadn't turned away Yuji in that moment, Yuta wouldn't have been cut in half. And now that we're very clearly doing the whole Megami is fighting back thing, if Yuta does die, it's kind of on Megami. Sukuna then continues by saying, oh right, also the brat you saved ended up slaughtering thousands. And it's like, hey man, that was you. I know you were in Yuji's body then, but that was you. We then see during all of this that some kind of amorphous black mob is trying to swallow Megami whole. And it's revealed over the course of this chapter that that black blob is Sukuna's true form. And thus that black blob with its multiple mouths and multiple eyes is trying to convince Megami to give it all up and let Sukuna take control of his body. However, before it can do that, Megami responds to him by saying, why do you sound so desperate? Is it because there's only one more of your fingers left? Obviously referring to the one finger that's floating in the domain that Yuji and Sukuna are currently battling in. Megami then goes on to say that there's a particular way to turn yourself into a cursed object, which means that if Itadori takes no care in tearing you from me here, you'll die. Plus, Nobara's resonance is bad news for you. If the 19 fingers that currently exist in my body right now are destroyed, the singular finger that's left won't have enough soul pull to pull you to it. That is to say that essentially what Megami is saying is that if Sukuna is defeated right here, right now, the 19 fingers that are inside of Megami will effectively be destroyed. And as that will represent 95% of Sukuna's soul, the 5% of Sukuna's soul that exists outside of his body won't be enough to pull that 95% to it. And thus, at least what I think is being said here is that if Yuji takes no care in removing Sukuna from Megami, that Sukuna will die. However, I'm not entirely sure of that fact. It could either mean that the entirety of Sukuna will die, yes, or it'll just mean that 95% of Sukuna will die and 5% of him will continue to exist outside of Megami's body. And unfortunately, that question isn't really ever answered. See, because Megami goes on to say, I can see that death scares you. He goes on to tell Sukuna, from the very beginning, I never intended to live a proper life. It sounds obvious, but there are a ton more people in this world than just little old me. Just once more, I want to try living for somebody who's not me. Now, obviously, this was in reference to something that Megami said a couple of chapters ago, where when he, in a conversation with Yuji, talked about how all he really wanted from life was the ability to protect his sister. And so long as he could live a mundane life with the people he loved, he'd be happy. And thus, in essence, what Megami is announcing to Sukuna here is that while you might have taken my sister away from me, I've my entire life lived for other people. And while that person for the entirety of my life was my my sister, I now want to live my life for everybody else. Everybody else that would benefit from you not existing. And thus, in essence, this is Megami finding his will to live. Now, it's in this moment that we see what we can assume to be Yuji's domain shattering. And as it begins to shatter, it's revealed that it's shattering because Yuji is punching Sukuna through the wall of it. Yuji lands a hard right-handed punch into Sukuna's chest that sends him flying backwards. However, it's not Sukuna anymore, because apparently the series of attacks from Nobara and Yuji were enough to separate Sukuna from Megami. Yes, because as what we believe to be Sukuna is flying backwards after being punched by Yuji, we see that the amorphous blob that was talking to Megami is actually trying to reach out to Megami's body. A series of claws, eyes, and mouths with no real structural form, being simultaneously torn from Megami but also reaching out to his flying body. And thus in the next page we see Megami's unconscious body laying on the roof of a building, with Yuji still holding the form of the follow-through of his punch. And between them lays what appears to be Sukuna's true form. A convulsing, wet mass of skin with more eyes, mouth, and hands than it could ever possibly need. However, as soon as we get a punch in on Sukuna, we see a shadow appear above it. And then in an almost one-to-one parallel with Mahito's death, we see Yuji standing above Sukuna. However, before Sukuna is able to do anything, he begins to burn away. An unstable amalgamation of cursed objects without a host, he begins to disintegrate into cursed energy. And thus Yuji looks down on him and says, "What's it gonna be, Sukuna?" And it's at this point that we see Sukuna going through a flashback where Yuji told him to release Megami so that he would spare his life. We then once again get a pretty much one-to-one parallel with Mahito's death, as Yuji, like a band that was big in 2002, plays the hits. Because as Yuji crouches down to scoop up the last remnants of Sukuna, he looks at him and says, "Sukuna, you are me." And I'm gonna be real, I might sound like a hater here. I just don't love this. I don't love this. Like, we did this already with Mahito. And look, I get Mahito was uniquely evil and deserved every ounce of it, and so does Sukuna. But like, do we have to one-to-one copy the Mahito scene? But regardless, Yuji goes on to say, with the remnants of Sukuna fading away in his hands, we are born into this world unconsciously shouldering curses. What sort of monster you turn into is entirely based on your luck. But I had my gramps. Yuji then goes on to say, "Sukuna, let's try it once again. But instead, this time, instead of cursing each other, let's live alongside each other. Even if no one will accept you, I'll live with you." Basically, like once again in Yuji's domain, pitying Sukuna. However, Sukuna is now in a pitiable state, as he is at this point basically just a smoldering pile of ashes. Sukuna goes on to say, "I'm impressed that you would take this farce this far. Yuji, don't underestimate me. I'm a curse." And then he's dead. Listen, I get that Yuji's trying to go the friendship route here, but that's just like such a big tonal shift over the course of the last couple of chapters. Like, this is the dude who killed Chozo, possibly Kusakabe, maybe Yuta, the lawyer guy whose name I'm currently forgetting. Like, why are we trying to run a redemption arc for him, Yuji? If we're running one-to-one parallels with the Mahito scene here, the "you are me" moment is supposed to be Yuji telling Mahito that I'm just gonna keep killing cursed spirits until all of you go away, because we're both cogs in the machine, just on opposite sides. And if we're trying to run through that exact same ideology, then Yuji immediately following up by going, "Sukuna, you are me, let's be friends," just doesn't make that much sense, because that's not who Sukuna was. And for the life of me, I can't really figure out what Yuji means by "Sukuna, you are me," unless of course he is trying to make a direct reference to what he said to Mahito. But unfortunately, out of all the explanations, that one makes the least amount of sense. Now, if Yuji is simply saying that because they spent so much time together and they shaped each other over the course of the year that they were together, that they are one, that I would understand. But also, Yuji, you're better without him. I don't know. I just don't like this whole friendship approach thing from Yuji. Just like stomp out Sukuna. Also, if I could, don't make Sukuna go out like such a bitch. Listen, I get we're trying to have a total embarrassing defeat for the King of Curses, but like, a lot of people in this story genuinely love Sukuna. I'm not one of them, but there is a lot of them. Him going out like Envy in Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood is just... it's just a weird choice. If we're sticking with FMAB, I would so much rather he go out like somebody like Wrath, dying with his hands firmly up. But instead, that just feels oddly disrespectful to somebody who was one of the greatest antagonists in manga history. Like, I get that we're trying to hammer home the fact that Sukuna was lonely and angry and therefore pitiable, but I don't know, that's just not how I would have conveyed that message. After Sukuna's death, we cut to two people that we haven't seen in 40 chapters, Hikari and Arame. And wouldn't you know it, the most important thing that's revealed here is that Arame, not a femboy like we thought. Just a femme, because it's revealed that Arame is a woman. Maybe, kind of. They have a binding on their chest, which is most likely to indicate the fact that they are a woman, but they were binding their chest to look like a boy, and therefore they caught femboy allegations and the attention of Hikari. He loves them. But when we come back to them, the first thing that we see is Arame saying, "It's finished." And Hikari agrees, saying, "Yep, looks like it's all over. What are you gonna do now?" To which Arame says, like you said, it's over. There's nothing more I can do. Arame then continues on to say, the only possible way that Sukuna would be defeated is if his incarnated form came to light. That is to say that if Sukuna's true form, which was the blob with all the mouths, eyes, and nails, came to light and faded away. Arame then continues on by saying, you plebeians had no strength. It was just that luck was on your side. And all the while that they're saying this, it appears as though ice is growing up from their neck to their head. Arame then finishes off what they're saying by saying, you simply were lucky because you were born 1,000 years too late. Hikari then laughs at this and says, oh, luck was on my side? That's the highest compliment you could pay to a guy like me. And considering the fact that Arame, for the course of the last 40 to 50 chapters, has probably just been watching Hikari spam jackpot after jackpot, this gets a legitimate chuckle out of them as they say, huh, I guess you're right. They then blow themselves up into a flurry of ice crystals. Yep. That's all we got of the Hikari Arame fight, was Arame being like, well, I'm out. That doesn't make sense. Yeah, technically Arame has nothing to live for now that Sukuna is gone. But would I have liked a little bit more explanation on Arame's character outside of the fact that they were just a simp for Sukuna? Yeah. Absolutely. Have they been alive for the last 1,000 years? Were they a reincarnated sorcerer? How did they meet Sukuna? Why did they adore Sukuna? How'd the fight against Hikari go? I'd like to see him hit a couple of jackpots myself. But nope. Just an Irish goodbye. That's fine. It has to be fine. Now, to this point that we get to the part of the chapter that everybody likes. Because after Arame re-enters the water cycle, the next page shows Megumi waking up with his head on a pillow. And as he sits up in bed, he grumbles, what are you doing? And it's at this point that we see Yuji pushing a wide open box with Nobara inside of it, with ribbon that was clearly going to be used to tie the box closed sitting below it. And it's at this point that Yuji and Nobara explain that they were trying to pull a Kugasaki Lives prank, much akin to the prank that was pulled on Megumi and Nobara when Yuji was brought back to life after his heart was destroyed by Sukuna. At which point Megumi says, oh, my bad. But trying to not let the moment get too dour, Nobara decides to take the spotlight for herself and says, so guys, the Madonna you guys all thought was dead is alive and kicking. Were you so shocked that you pissed yourself, or maybe crying tears of joy? To which Yuji responds by saying, I cried a couple of tears when you landed at resonance, implying that he said the I cried a couple of tears thing out loud and then thought the resonance bit. And Megumi goes on to say that I wasn't all that surprised because I found out while I was inside of Sukuna. Now, I don't necessarily know what that means. I think that just means that, like, Megumi didn't have emotions while he was inside of Sukuna. Because, like, it's fairly obvious that Sukuna didn't know that Nobara was alive before everybody else knew that Nobara was alive. So I'm thinking it was something like the bath stopped Megumi from feeling things? I don't really know, and we'll never know. Kind of like how we'll never know how Nobara was brought back to life. At least, maybe, because they don't explain it this chapter. Like, yeah, we can probably assume that they were able to get her to some center where they used RCT on her to resuscitate her, but we don't know that for sure. She was gone for almost 140 chapters, and they're just kind of like, she's back now. And, like, maybe they'll talk about it next chapter, considering the fact that next chapter is supposed to revolve around them saving Yuta. I know, spoilers. But I just figured that that kind of thing would be explained basically as soon as they could. Regardless, Megumi goes on to think, seems like a class of 3 is all we've got, huh? I guess that is to say that nobody else has joined the Tokyo Jujutsu High class that they're all in, which, like, why would you after what just went down? Yuji then hijacks the conversation and says, alrighty, well, all 3 of us are here, so I guess it's about time that we open these. Ieri-san gave these to us and told me to give them to you. Megumi questions letters, and Nobara says, oh, this will be a trip. I can't even imagine what he wrote. Yuck. Yuji then says, that's pretty harsh. But it's this moment that Megumi realizes that there's only 2 letters, one for Megumi and one for Nobara. And it's at that point that Yuji says, yeah, there's no letter for me, but that's because Gojo told me everything I needed to know while we were both hanging out before he died. Megumi then says, whatever, let's get this over with, as Nobara shows visual and audible disgust from the letter that she's gotten from Gojo, which causes Yuji to ask, what'd he say? Nobara goes on to say that this isn't a letter, it's just information about where my mom is and how she's doing. At which point Yuji responds by saying, wait, you didn't know that? And Nobara responds by saying, it's more like I didn't care. Now, we don't really know a huge amount about Nobara's mom. Basically, all we know about Nobara is that she moved to a small town when she was young and she felt like an outsider there the entire time. However, during her time living in that small town, she was particularly pulled to people like Sayori, and therefore, whether or not Nobara's relationship was strained with her mother wasn't necessarily information we were privy to prior to this. Never necessarily implied that she was an orphan or didn't live with her mother, and yet she decides, well, I gotta give him credit for at least finding that chick. Now, to this point, that Megami begins to laugh, and Nobara begins to freak out as she realizes that she very rarely, if not ever, has seen Megami laugh. And thus both Nobara and Yuji jump on Megami, begging to see the letter that Gojo wrote him. And thus Megami tells the two of them, well, it's pretty similar to what he wrote in your letter, Nobara. But when Nobara reads the letter, she says, why are you laughing at this? It's a major downer. But Megami, with a giant smile on his face, says, it's all good. To which Yuji responds by saying, well, if you say so. And it's this point that we see the letter written by Gojo, which is telling Megami, sorry, your daddy's dead and buried. I killed that guy. And then Gojo wrote a chibi version of himself in the bottom right corner of the letter saying, sorry. And honestly, this is my favorite moment from this chapter, by a long shot. One, it makes my heart incredibly happy to see Megami happy. God knows after everything he's been through, he deserves it. And two, genuinely one of the biggest things I've missed from JJK, even though all the middle parts were incredible, was Team Gojo being together, being the silly high schoolers they are. The individual personalities of each and every single one of them shine when they're with each other. So getting to see a moment like this is not only incredibly sweet, but also incredibly cathartic. However, before they get to spend the rest of the day laughing about Gojo's letter, Nobara says, oh, shoot, we need to get to Maki and the others. And thus both Yuji and Nobara get up and start walking. But Megami is confused, and Yuji simply just says, you're coming too, Megami. And as Megami begins to walk with them, he says, oh, you're right. I have to say sorry to everybody and thank them for all the work that they did. But Nobara assures Megami that this has nothing to do with Sukuna, but rather it has something to do with Yuta. And it's at this point that we cut to Inamaki, Panda, and Maki. We also see Kusakabe, who's alive, Miwa, and the witch girl whose name I refuse to remember. And in the last panel of this chapter, we see Yuji, Megami, and Nobara all walking in the same direction. And thus all the living members of the Kusakabe coalition, outside of people like Wee Wee and Mei Mei, are making their way towards Yuta. And over all of this, we hear Yuji saying, we've got to save his life. And then we see somebody who we don't know yelling, Yuta, you son of a bitch! To which we see Megami responding by saying, is that what saving Yuta sounds like? And then the editor's note for this chapter is Yuta Kotsu all right? Only 3 more chapters to go. And it also lets us know that there's gonna be a break next week. So this leaves us with a couple of open-ended questions. What happened to Yuta? How is he still technically alive? Is he still in Gojo's body? Was his brain transferred back to his body? Why does everybody need to be there? Do they all need to cheer on Yuta? Do they all need to pour their cursed energy into Shoko so that she can maximize her RCT output and save Yuta's life? Is Yuta gonna be forced to live the rest of his life in Gojo's body? Will he still have Kenjaku's body swapping technique? Will Rika still haunt his body? Who is yelling at him? All of these are fantastic questions, but unfortunately we don't have a ton of answers. All that we really can say is that the person yelling at him isn't Maki, Inomaki, Panda, Kusakabe, Miwa, Witch Girl, or Nobara, Megami, or Yuji. Now I also highly doubt that it's Shoko, as she's a very quiet individual, and that's when it boils down to it, the only person that I could genuinely see yelling at Yuta is either Hikari or Todo. And yes, Todo is almost definitely alive. If Kusakabe survived, Todo survived. I also, however, for some reason, feel as though it could be Rika. See, because here's the thing. Rika was holding on to Yuta's corpse, fully manifested and separate from Yuta's consciousness. And thus I think it is an actual possibility that Rika could become an actual character separate of Yuta moving forward. And as crazy as that idea sounds, it'll make a lot more sense when I dedicate an entire video to it, which I'll be filming soon. So make sure you hit the noti button. But overall, how do I feel about this chapter? Well, unfortunately, prior to filming videos like this, I don't necessarily know entirely. But now that I've sat down and genuinely spent an hour yapping about this chapter, I feel good. I'm happy. I like that Team Gojo is back together. I like that less people died than I anticipated. There was still some incredibly key and brutal losses, but if the price to pay to get an ending such as this, especially an ending that could possibly include the revival of Yuta, is not seeing Hikari and Arame's fight and Sukuna kind of going out like a bitch, I can live with that. Well, this isn't exactly how I would have landed the plane. I can't argue with the plane being on the ground. I got what I wanted. And like I've already said, I would love to have known more about the merger. This is the first time in anime and manga history I genuinely remember a worst case scenario being introduced and not at least starting. On top of that, I'd love to know more about Tengen and Kenjaku's backstory. I'd love to hear more about Tsukuna's backstory or Rame's backstory. I'd like to know more about the Elders, why Gojo hated him so much, what the world is going to look like now without the Elders and Gakuganji in charge. I'm disappointed that the idea of Cursed Corpse only ever applied to Panda. I'd like to know what the world is going to look like now that 2 of the 3 major sorcerer adventurer clans are gone, and so much more. And while obviously a lot of these questions could possibly be answered in the next 3 chapters, I believe that the majority of the next chapter is going to be dedicated to bringing Yuta back to life, that the last chapter will be dedicated to a far-off future where Team Gojo graduates from Jujutsu High, and that the second to last chapter is really the only chapter we have left to give us any exposition about the future of the JJK world. So while I oscillate between whether or not I feel as though this ending is rushed, after this chapter I feel less as though this ending is being rushed, but unfortunately when it comes to the end of the story, and I have a lot of lingering questions, I probably will feel more like this ending is rushed. Because here's the thing, we're technically doing all the things we need to do to finish the story, and fleshing out all the things that I just talked about would have been side plots. But unfortunately the way that my brain works is that I want as much information about a universe as possible, but I think it's genuinely a possibility that Gege might be a little bit sicker than we even anticipated. I mean, all of us remember a couple of weeks ago when Gege had to take more than a month off from this story, and therefore I believe that while he may not be rushing towards the end of the story, he might be cutting some of the elective exposition he could have put in if he felt better. However, that's not the end of the world. See, because the anime has already began to put in some things that don't exist in the manga, elaborating on fights and going even further by giving us director's cuts that add several minutes to episodes. And thus I believe the ending of the story might just be a framework that Gege is laying down so that the anime can elaborate on it later. Because even though JJK is one of the most popular manga on Earth, it's probably more popular as an anime. And for good reason, the anime is incredible. But who's to say? At the end of the day, while there was some things I didn't love in this chapter, overall I'm pretty happy with it. I mean, how couldn't I be? Team Gojo is back together, minus, Gojo, of course. But he's there in spirit and letters. But I'm curious to hear from you guys. What did you think about this chapter? What did you think of Sukuna's end? What did you think of Urame's end? Tell me in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. I can't love everything all the time. That's just bad content.